How could you?
I'm leaving.
Wait, please, don't do this.
It was the final countdown of the year at the hardest reservation in Manhattan. Rachel Carter, billionaire tycoon and three-time Fortune cover star, stood at the maitre d's podium processing a phrase she hadn't heard in a decade. Fully committed. She had enough capital to buy the deed to the building, but she couldn't buy a chair inside it. She pivoted to leave, brushing past families toasting with champagne and kids practicing their midnight countdowns when a man and his little girl abruptly stood up. He locked eyes with her and signaled. Why did a flick of a stranger's hand feel so heavy? Rachel Carter was a woman who walked into boardrooms and silenced the room just by sitting down. She had stared down sharks twice her age and made them flinch first. Yet, hovering by the velvet rope at Lemon Ashanti on New Year's Eve, a foreign chill crept up her back. Impotence. The host was 20-something, manicured and professionally regretful. He wore that specific pitying smile service workers reserve for rich people they assume are resilient. Rachel didn't feel resilient. She had left the executive assistant at the penthouse, no black car idling at the curb, no reservation on the books because the concept of no had ceased to exist in her world. Tonight was meant to be a departure. Tonight she wanted to be just a woman dining solo by preference, not necessity. The dining room hummed like a lit-up jewelry box. Crystal fixtures fractured the light over starched white linens. Families occupied every square inch. Little girls in velvet frocks, lovers whispering close over Pinot Noir. Laughter rippled through the air, warm and unforced, the sound of people who had found their tribe. Rachel lingered on the periphery, clutching her trench coat, feeling the burn of gazes that failed to register her fame. 3 magazine covers meant nothing here. In this room, she was just a walk-in without a booking. The host made a vague motion toward the bar area. He floated the idea of waiting, while signaling with his eyes that she would be standing there until next year. His voice was gentle but absolute. Rachel knew that tone. She had weaponized it herself 1,000 times. It was the sound of a gate slamming shut. Her mind went to her wallet. She could offer triple the check average. She could buy out a table and send a family home with a massive payout. The offer died in her throat. Bribing her way in would only seal the verdict she was already feeling, that she was an imposter here. Not tonight. Rachel turned her back on the warmth. She walked with measured steps, heels distinct against the marble, each click a tiny humiliation. The room behind her throbbed with a conviviality she couldn't access. A dad poured sparkling juice for his boy. A grandma thumbed frosting off a toddler's chin. A couple touched glasses, the crystal chiming soft and sure. Rachel had constructed an empire. She had bent markets to her will, birthed products, and disrupted entire sectors. But this currency didn't spend here. You couldn't negotiate a family into existence. Her hand found the brass cold of the door handle. The winter draft sliced in, biting her skin. Beyond the glass, New York glittered with a cynical brilliance. The whole world was toasting together. The whole world had a +1. Rachel knuckled her coat tighter. Home was the only option. She would pour a neat scotch, take her post by the window, and watch the pyrotechnics in silence, just like the last 4 years. It was acceptable. She had curated this existence. She had swapped intimacy for influence, and influence had made her bulletproof. Then the sound cut through. A small inquisitive voice piercing the din. A kid. Rachel glanced back almost against her will. Dead center of the room, a small girl was standing on the rungs of her chair, white-knuckling the table edge. She looked about 6 or 7 dark curls, wrestled back with a sparkly barrette. She was staring right at Rachel, no recognition, no sympathy. Just that raw, unfiltered curiosity kids have for things that don't fit. The girl yanked on the sleeve of the guy next to her. He was a big guy, broad shoulders, wearing a button-down that looked like he had ironed it himself on the kitchen table. He had a face that carried its burdens, quietly tired eyes, working hands. He checked his daughter, then tracked her line of sight to Rachel frozen there in the entryway. The girl whispered something Rachel couldn't catch. The man dipped his head, listening. His face changed. A flicker of surprise, maybe a beat of hesitation. He studied Rachel again, taking a longer look this time, and an expression crossed his features she couldn't quite place. Then he sat up. He looked at the empty seat opposite him. He looked back at the billionaire, and slowly he lifted a hand and waved. It wasn't a grand summon. It wasn't even confident. His hand hovered for a moment, tentative and slightly clumsy before retreating to the tablecloth, but the offer was unmistakable. Rachel froze in the doorway, her brain scrambling to process a signal she didn't have a decoder for. In her world, outstretched hands were usually accompanied by invoices, demands for capital, or pleas for her endorsement. Nobody simply waved her over to a table on New Year's Eve without an agenda. Beside him, the little girl was practically vibrating in her seat, waving both arms like Rachel was a long-lost aunt finally returning from the war. The father murmured a soft correction, and the child sank back into her chair, though her eyes remained locked on Rachel. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. The maitre d' paused, and a busboy stuttered in his tracks near the kitchen swinging doors. At a nearby booth, a woman dipped her head to whisper something scandalous to her husband. Every survival instinct screamed at Rachel to turn on her heel, march out with her armor intact, and delete this glitch from the evening. Accepting charity from strangers felt dangerously close to admitting she was destitute. It required surrendering the head of the table, stepping into a space where she held no leverage and commanded no authority, just another guest. Yet her fingers had already let go of the brass handle and her heels were pivoting on the tile. She navigated the dining room again, moving through the low murmur of families and the startled gaze of the staff, feeling the room hold its breath as she passed. She arrived at the humble two-top table where the pair sat waiting. From this distance, the imperfections were visible. The girl's holiday dress bore the faint creases of suitcase travel. The man's tie was knotted slightly off-center, and the table held the remnants of a modest meal alongside a glass of pink lemonade. He rose to his feet as she approached, though he kept his hands to himself. With a soft, deliberate voice, he simply pointed to the vacant chair and mentioned they had room if she cared to join. Rachel studied his face, then shifted her gaze to the child who was beaming with a warmth that seemed entirely irrational. Staring at the empty seat, Rachel Carter did something that defied every rule in her corporate playbook. She took the seat, and before the fabric even settled, the girl launched into introductions, stating her name was Sophia. She was 7 3/4 a devotee of unicorn science and mac and cheese, strictly in that hierarchy of importance. She spoke with the breathless, unfiltered honesty of a child who hasn't yet learned to curate her personality for an audience. She fired off a volley of inquiries about the venue, Rachel's solitude, and her maternal status, forcing Rachel to respond with uncharacteristic hesitation. Childless. Solo. Lovely decor. The man finally cut in. He introduced himself as Carlos Brooks, offering no rationale for the sudden invitation. There were no apologies for the disruption, no awkward jokes to break the tension. He simply welcomed her and asked if she had eaten. Rachel admitted she hadn't had a bite. Carlos signaled a server with an easy confidence, acting as if pulling a wealthy stranger into their family dinner was standard procedure. Rachel kept her hands clasped tight in her lap, feeling rigid and stripped of her usual armor like an actor thrust onto a stage without a script. Sophia, however, refused to let the energy die, dragging Rachel into the present with a relentless, sunny curiosity. Across the table, Carlos remained a calm anchor, comfortable enough in his own skin to let the silence breathe. He didn't force conversation, simply allowing the evening to find its own rhythm. For the first time in a decade, Rachel Carter wasn't driving the bus, and surprisingly, it didn't feel like a defeat. When the menu arrived, she took it, her eyes glossing over the prices out of ingrained habit. While she read the entrees, she felt the weight of Sophia's gaze, that intense, unblinking scrutiny specific to children. The girl rested her chin in her palms, studying Rachel as if she were a complex riddle waiting to be deciphered. Carlos shot a look at his daughter, then offered Rachel a fleeting expression that sat somewhere between amusement and apology. Sophia shattered the quiet by demanding to know Rachel's preferred color. The banality of the question nearly startled a laugh out of her. "Blue," she answered. Sophia nodded with grave professional interest, noting that her own allegiance lay with purple, specifically not pink, a common misconception. A specific shade like the twilight sky just before nightfall. Rachel found herself nodding in agreement, struck by the realization that it had been an eternity since she'd discussed anything not tied to net worth or quarterly earnings. Carlos placed Sophia's order with paternal efficiency, bypassing the need for consultation. Plain chicken tenders and fries sauce on the side, while requesting a medium-rare steak for himself. When the server turned his attention to Rachel, she froze. She typically scanned the room before the menu, tailoring her appetite to match the decor, but tonight, the social script was blank. She blurted out salmon and surrendered the laminate card before doubt could creep back in. The server vanished, leaving a heavy quiet in his wake. Yet the air between them had shifted. It felt less brittle now as Sophia broke the silence to ask if Rachel was an animal person. Rachel nodded yes despite her empty, pet-free home, while Sophia confessed her own longing for a dog, a dream currently crushed by their building's strict lease. The girl launched into a vivid taxonomy of her hypothetical pup, a golden retriever, or perhaps a husky, or maybe one of those cotton ball creatures that resembled a drifting cloud. Carlos watched her with the practiced endurance of a father who had sat through this specific monologue 1,000 times, offering her the floor without a single interruption. Rachel studied him, watching his daughter, noting how the tension in his frame seemed to physically melt whenever the girl grinned. "What's the plan for when you're big?" Rachel asked, to which Sophia weighed her options. Scientist baker? Why not both? She could engineer entirely new species of pastry, she reasoned. Imagine a cake tasting of sweet strawberries but constructed from spinach. Stealth health, a concept Rachel praised as genius, making Sophia light up like a bulb. Across the centerpiece, Carlos met Rachel's gaze, and for a heartbeat, a silent frequency hummed between them. It was a mutual acknowledgement that they were in the presence of a force of nature, and they were both barely holding on. Plates hit the table, and the talk settled into the comfortable cadence of a shared meal, Sophia chatting through mouthfuls and firing off questions with innocent curiosity. Was Rachel a roller coaster fan? Had she seen the sea? What was her pizza allegiance? Rachel fielded them all, startled by the dusty archives of her own preferences she had to unlock. She enjoyed coasters, though it had been 20 years since her last ride. As for the ocean, she recalled one childhood trip to North Carolina where the scorching sand burned her soles. Her favorite pizza was plain cheese, a choice Sophia validated as the only rational option. Carlos remained mostly an observer, but his rare interjections held a grounding solidity that settled Rachel's nerves. There was zero posturing in his demeanor. He didn't probe for her job title or zip code, skipping the usual social interrogation people use to calculate net worth and standing. He simply occupied the space opposite her, anchored in the moment, allowing the night to breathe at its own speed. Sophia polished off her chicken tenders and declared a sudden need for the ladies' room. Carlos was on his feet instantly, but Sophia waved him down, insisting she could manage solo since she was after all 7 3/4. That was practically grown, she reminded him. Carlos wavered, eyeing the restrooms tucked away in the rear of the diner. "Straight back," he ordered, earning an exaggerated eye roll, the universal sign for "you are smothering me." She hopped down and marched off, the sparkly clip in her hair bouncing with every stride. Silence reclaimed the booth, and Rachel stared at her fish, acutely conscious of the void now that their tiny buffer was gone. He focused on his steak, dissecting it with surgical precision. She wondered if the tension was mutual and scrambled for a topic, something real, not just weather or fillers. "How long have you two been locals?" she ventured. Carlos glanced up, blinking, and said about 3 years. They had left Boston behind after his wife died. He delivered the news, plain stripped of theatrics, stating it like a fact of geography worn smooth by time. The atmosphere grew heavy, and Rachel fumbled internally, feeling that standard sympathies were too cheap. But saying nothing was worse, so she finally offered a quiet, "I'm so sorry." Carlos gave a small nod, absorbing the sentiment with the dignity of a man who expects nothing from the world. It was a long illness, he elaborated. Sophia was 4 back then, old enough to keep the image young enough that the edges were starting to fade. The early days were brutal, he admitted. Trying to play mother and father, learning to braid hair and pack lunches while his own world was gray, and he just wanted to vanish. But the girl needed a dad. That necessity dragged him out of the dark inch by inch until the calendar turned and the burden became a familiar weight he knew how to shoulder. Rachel sat still, offering no platitudes, no attempts to mirror his pain with her own. She simply bore witness, and Carlos seemed grateful for the silence. Sophia was the engine. He said the reason his feet hit the floor every morning. She gave the chaos order. Rachel mentally replayed her usual morning grind, the alarm screaming at 5 o'clock, chugging bitter caffeine while staring blankly out the window, firing off directives before dawn even broke. She had architected a seamless existence, a fortress of logic and efficiency, where she was the sole inhabitant. Carlos lowered his voice, asking with a gentle hesitation if she had any kin in the city. It was the first time he had breached the professional perimeter, and her internal security systems flared immediately. The urge to pivot to corporate pleasantries was strong, yet his gaze held a quiet empathy that disarmed her standard evasions. She admitted she was on her own. Her folks were long gone, and the brother in Seattle might as well be a stranger for all the calling they did. The career had cannibalized the decades. She had constructed a kingdom only to find the throne room empty. The confession spilled out messier than she liked, but Carlos didn't offer platitudes. He simply dipped his chin in silent recognition. He murmured that solitude has a funny way of sneaking up on you. You can drown in it at a crowded gala or suffocate in a boardroom full of accolades. Rachel felt a hairline fracture spread across her composure. For years she had equated isolation with invincibility, confusing a thick skin for a strong heart. But, staring at the man across the laminate table, the deception dissolved. She was starving for connection and had been for a lifetime. Just then, Sophia came skidding back, winded and beaming. She proclaimed the discovery of a massive aquarium down the hall, insisting she had tallied exactly 17 swimmers, though she suspected an 18th was playing hard to get. Carlos grinned, checking the hygiene situation. Sophia flashed her palms as evidence. The tension evaporated, leaving Rachel feeling lighter than she had in ages. The little girl turned to Rachel, asking if she ever sent wishes up to shooting stars. Rachel admitted she hadn't looked up at the night sky in forever. Sophia declared that a tragedy. Wishes were non-negotiable. You had to cast them out there, even the impossible ones, just in case the cosmos had its ears open. Curious, Rachel asked what a kid like her would bargain for. Sophia chewed on the thought, head cocked. She decided she wanted her father to find joy. Real, cinematic joy. Carlos watched his child with a look that defied simple vocabulary. It was fierce affection mixed with a humbling awe. He told her she was all the happiness he required. The girl scrunched her nose, rejecting the premise. She wanted him to have a partner in crime for the boring hours, someone to giggle with while she was learning math, someone to share the couch with after lights out. Rachel felt like a trespasser in a sanctuary. She studied the grease on her plate, sensing the sudden gravity anchoring the table. Carlos coughed, insisting he was perfectly content, but his daughter gave a skeptical shrug before attacking her fries again. The chatter resumed, yet Rachel couldn't shake the impact of witnessing such raw, unpolished truth. Then chocolate cake materialized out of nowhere. The server announced it was on the house for New Year's Eve. Sophia looked like she'd won the lottery. Carlos nodded his thanks and portioned the slice 3 ways, sliding a plate to Rachel as if she belonged there. She took it and they ate together in a quiet rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Sophia quizzed Rachel on New Year's pledges. Rachel confessed she had retired the practice due to a poor track record. The girl demanded to know why. Rachel reflected that her lists were always corporate strategies, smashing quotas or capturing demographics. They felt less like hopes and more like business plans, projections masquerading as personal growth. Sophia pressed for what a genuine vow looked like, stumping her. She had tracked her existence on spreadsheets for so long she had forgotten other units of measurement existed. Carlos murmured that maybe a true resolution isn't about acquisition, but evolution, learning to be softer, bolder, or just there. Rachel met his gaze, and he stared back, and she understood the message wasn't for the 6-year-old. It was for her. The din in the diner swelled as folks zipped up parkas and settled tabs, bracing for the midnight bell. Sophia vibrated with energy, demanding a time check. Carlos glanced at his wrist, 40 minutes to go. Sophia threw her head back and let out a theatrical groan, complaining that 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Carlos busted out laughing, a rich, unguarded sound that caught Rachel off guard. It transformed him, smoothing out the exhaustion lines around his eyes and making him look years younger. Rachel mumbled a polite excuse and slipped away to the ladies' room. She navigated the dining room, weaving through clusters of families and couples who fit together like puzzle pieces before locking herself in the sanctuary of a stall. Leaning against the door, she just breathed, trying to make sense of the tightness in her chest. Tonight wasn't supposed to mean anything. She'd only shown up because the alternative, ringing in another year alone in a penthouse that felt more like a museum, was unbearable. But sitting there with the mechanic and his kid, she felt a sensation that had been foreign to her for years. She felt visible. Not as the titan of industry, not as the glossed-up figure on business magazines, but just human. Messy, lonely, and trying her best. She scrubbed her hands at the sink and caught her reflection. The hair and lipstick were armor-perfect, but the eyes gave her away softer, maybe a little haunted. She couldn't tell. Shaking off the water, she headed back to the booth. When she slid back in, Sophia beamed as if Rachel had been gone for days. Carlos quietly topped off her water glass without making a production of it. It was such a minor act, but it hit her hard. He'd decided she had a place at this table, that she wasn't just some stray they were feeding out of charity. Rachel murmured a thank you, and he gave a short, acknowledging nod. The silence that settled over the table didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt lived in. Sophia was busy attacking a napkin with a crayon she'd charmed off a waiter. She sketched a lopsided house with a pointy roof and a sun exploding with way too many beams. Then came 3 stick figures, hand in hand. She tapped the tall one. "That's Poppy." The medium-sized scribbling she announced was herself. Then she pointed to the tiniest figure. "That's you, Rachel." Rachel stared at the wobbly ink lines connecting them and felt a sharp pang behind her ribs. She cleared her throat and asked why she was drawn so small. Sophia shrugged as if it were obvious. "You look sad. Sad people take up less room." Rachel sat there, speechless, stripped bare by a 6-year-old. Carlos glanced at the napkin, then up at Rachel, a look of quiet understanding passing between them. It was a silent admission that kids see the ghosts adults try to bury. Then the energy in the room shifted. Voices swelled. Diners began drifting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sophia grabbed her dad's hand, practically dragging him toward the view. Carlos stood up, but he didn't follow her immediately. He looked back at Rachel, waiting. Rachel pushed herself up and trailed them to the glass. Sophia wedged herself right between the two adults, gripping their hands. The warmth of that small hand shocked Rachel. She couldn't recall the last time she'd made physical contact that wasn't a handshake. A chant started rippling through the crowd. 10-9-8. Rachel scanned the room. It was a sea of connection kisses, hugs, parents hoisting kids onto shoulders. 7-6-5. She glanced at Carlos, but his eyes were fixed on his daughter, and Sophia was staring up at the dark sky, vibrating with anticipation. 4-3-2. Rachel felt the moment dilate, etching itself into her memory. 1. The room exploded in noise, cheers, whistles, and the sharp pop of champagne corks. Beyond the glass, the Manhattan skyline erupted in showers of gold and silver fire. Sophia squealed and bounced on her heels, refusing to let go of their hands. Rachel realized her own face was hurting. She was smiling, not the practiced grimace for board meetings or press junkets, a genuine, unguarded smile. Sophia spun around and buried her face in her father's coat, hugging him with fierce little kid strength. Carlos stooped down, wrapping her up tight. Then the girl turned to Rachel. Before Rachel could stiffen up, the kid had her arms around Rachel's waist. Rachel froze, panic flaring for a split second. Then instinct took over. She rested her hands on the girl's back and held on. The kid smelled like birthday cake and cheap strawberry shampoo. Something inside Rachel cracked, not a violent break, but a gentle one like a rusted lock, finally clicking open. Sophia pulled back, grinning up at her. "Happy New Year." Rachel choked out the words in return, her voice tight. Carlos put out his hand. Rachel took it. His palm was rough, his grip steady. He held on a beat longer than social convention required. "Good to meet you," he said. And Rachel knew it wasn't a line. He wasn't networking. He wasn't trying to leverage her assets. He was just a man glad to share a human moment on a night that was hard to survive alone. The magic began to fade as the lights came up. Families started gathering coats and scarves. The restaurant thinned out, bringing the cold reality of the world back in. Rachel knew the script leave, go home, be the CEO again. She should say her polite goodbyes and retreat to her tower, but her feet wouldn't move. She wanted to linger in this little bubble of normalcy, this fleeting moment, where she wasn't a walking bank account, just a person standing by a window. For a moment, the titles and the net worth didn't matter. She was just Rachel. Carlos knelt to zip Sophia's coat, his rough hands moving with a gentle efficiency while the little girl fought off a yawn. Rachel buttoned her own cashmere coat, fingers fumbling slightly against the chill. She murmured a quiet thanks to Carlos for letting her crash their evening. He claimed the dinner was Sophia's doing. And the child, leaning heavily against her father's work-worn flannel, mumbled the truth. She had spotted the sadness in the lady's eyes. Carlos offered no correction. He simply regarded Rachel with a gaze of quiet, unpitying recognition. Rachel nodded, accepting the assessment. They headed for the door, the silence between the three of them heavy with words she didn't know how to voice. There was no script for a moment like this, so she simply trailed them past the bussers stacking dirty dishes, stepping out of the restaurant's warmth and into the biting New York freeze. The wind hit her like a physical slap, sharp and unforgiving, forcing her to clutch her lapels tighter against her throat. Carlos offered a polite good night. Sophia gave a sleepy wave, and then Rachel was left standing on the pavement, relegated to the role of observer once again. Just a working-class dad and his kid vanishing into the sea of revelers ringing in the new year. She remained rooted to the spot long after they were gone, jostled by strangers, realizing the hollow space in her chest had been replaced by something heavier. She couldn't name the feeling, only that she was no longer numb. Rachel held her ground on the concrete while the city swallowed Carlos and Sophia whole. Joyous, shouting masses flowed around her like a river around a stone. She had known isolation before, but this solitude had a different texture. It wasn't the sterile, air-conditioned detachment she had worn for years, the feeling of watching humanity through a museum display case. This was raw, jagged, immediate. It was the specific agony of having briefly felt the fire's heat only to be cast back out into the snow. She reached for her phone to summon a black car, then hesitated. 12 blocks. She could hoof it. She needed the bite of the air to ground herself. Her mind needed clearing to process why a dinner with strangers had shaken her foundation so thoroughly. Pocketing the device, she marched forward, the staccato click of designer heels against the grit syncing with the distant boom of fireworks. The avenue was absolute bedlam. Paper scraps swirled like blizzard snow while drunk, happy groups spilled from dive bars singing off-key and flashing cameras. Rachel drifted through the festivity like a specter, her four-figure coat acting as armor against the contagious joy surrounding her. Her mind cycled back to the sketch on the napkin. 3 jagged stick figures, hands clasped. She was the tiny one. Because grief shrinks you. A 7-year-old had diagnosed a lifetime of suppression in 10 minutes. Arriving at her high-rise, she received a crisp, contractual New Year's greeting from the doorman. She stepped into the private lift, watching the digital counter tick upward. 41 stories above the street. She had closed on this penthouse 5 years back, fresh off the IPO. It was supposed to be a trophy, a steel and glass testament to her dominance. Tonight, the luxury felt like solitary confinement. The doors slid open to her silent foyer. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the skyline, offering a master of the universe vantage point. The sprawl glittered below, infinite and electric. Rachel walked over and pressed a palm against the pane. The chill seeped through the thermal glazing, numbing her skin. Down there, the city pulsed with messy, vibrant life. Up here, she floated in a vacuum of climate-controlled, expensive silence broken only by the muted flash of dying fireworks. A fleeting thought arose: pour a scotch, or put on a record check the Tokyo markets, call someone. But she remained frozen, letting the repressed emotions breach the dam. The phantom sensation of the girl's small arms around her waist. The simple, unpretentious warmth of that booth. The way Carlos had studied her face when he said resolutions shouldn't be about metrics or acquisitions, but about the soul. Rachel's entire adult existence had been a series of acquisitions. She had shattered glass ceilings and constructed empires, ensuring her name would be on buildings. But the woman inside the suit was a stranger. She thought of her brother out west. Their relationship had withered to perfunctory biannual check-ins. He had stopped extending Thanksgiving invites after she chose a board meeting over turkey one too many times. She thought of the college roommate who eventually got the hint and stopped leaving voicemails. She thought of her executive assistant of 6 years who knew exactly how she took her latte but didn't know a single thing about her heart. She had constructed a fortress of competence so high that nobody could scale it. Now she was the one stuck in the tower. The glittering skyline swam out of focus. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, began to track down her cheeks. She hadn't wept like this in years, not even at her mother's funeral 8 years ago. She had been too busy managing the estate lawyers to grieve. She had worshipped at the altar of discipline for years, convinced it was her armor. But armor doesn't stop you from freezing to death. It just ensured she froze alone. Brushing a tear from her cheek, Rachel retreated to the kitchen. She filled a glass from the tap and downed it in one breath. The penthouse was dead quiet, save for the refrigerator's compressor and the muffled roar of the commoners down on the street. Sophia's naive wisdom echoed in her head, toss a wish into the void, she'd said, because the universe might actually have its ears open. Rachel didn't do fairy tales. She dealt in quarterly projections, tactical maneuvers, and hard KPIs. Yet here she was, clutching a glass in a marble kitchen at the dawn of the new year, indulging in the impossible. She regretted letting Carlos walk away without getting his contact info. A simple "thank you" felt so insufficient now. She longed to rewind the clock, to linger at that cheap table, soaking up the warmth of strangers who didn't want a piece of her net worth. That's the trouble with moments, though. Once they pass, they're gone. The busboy and his wife were likely tucking in for the night in their cramped apartment while she stood solitary in her fortress of skyline views and designer furniture. Monday loomed. The headquarters would be a ghost town, the staff burning through their PTO, but her office lights would be on. They always were. January was already booked solid. Boardrooms, conference calls, and high-stakes gambles determining the fiscal trajectory. The whole year unspooled before her mind's eye like a spreadsheet. 12 months of grinding monotony. Up at 5, desk until 8, unconsciousness repeat. That grind used to satisfy her. Tonight it felt less like a career and more like incarceration. She drifted back to the floor-to-ceiling glass. The sky was dark. The show was over. Below, the ants were scattering. The metropolis was entering that strange hungover lull where the party dies and reality sets in. Leaning her forehead against the cold pane, she shut out the view. Carlos's voice came back to her, something about how you can drown in isolation even when you're swimming in accolades and surrounded by a crowd. He got it. He'd walked that road. The difference was he found an exit ramp because he had Sophia holding the map. A reason to get out of bed. A human being who actually required his presence. Rachel kept 3,000 families fed with her payroll, but not one of those souls needed her. They needed the chairwoman. They needed the brain, the roadmap, and the bank account. They didn't need the woman inside the suit. Her eyes snapped open, catching her own ghost hovering in the window reflection. 42, but the exhaustion etched in her face read 50. That stranger in the glass possessed every asset she'd clawed for, yet held nothing that mattered. She pondered a resolution that wasn't a KPI. No EBITDA targets, no market share conquests. Just a promise to ensure she wasn't haunting this same window solitary and miserable 365 days from now. Maybe soften the edges, show some guts. Actually, be there, like Carlos suggested. Though what did presence even look like? She clocked 80-hour weeks. She fired off replies at the witching hour. She sat in every briefing, redlined every memo, made the final call on everything. She was practically omnipresent. But she knew he wasn't talking about attendance. He meant inhabiting her own life not as the boss but as a human being. Her mind drifted to her brother. Not a courtesy check-in, a real conversation. Asking how he's really doing, apologizing for bailing on Thanksgiving, confessing that she was drowning in silence. It scared her more than a plummeting stock price. Vulnerable wasn't in her lexicon. She'd constructed an empire on the foundation of being bulletproof. To her, neediness smelled like incompetence. But perhaps that was the glitch in her programming. Maybe real power wasn't about absolute independence. Maybe it was having the stones to say, I can't do this alone. She grabbed her device, nearly 2 a.m, way too late for a voice call. Still, she navigated to her brother's thread. Thumbs hovered, tapped a few words, backspaced, then tried again. She typed out a simple note, thinking of him, hoping his night was good, and asking if she could swing by sometime soon. She proofread it 3 times, thumb trembling over the blue arrow. It felt pathetic, honestly, but it was a crack in the wall. She hit send before her executive brain could veto the emotion. Delivered. She placed the phone on the counter, expecting silence tonight, maybe even tomorrow. But she'd broken protocol. She'd extended a hand. In the tiniest font possible, she'd admitted she wanted to be known. Not a merger, but an opening bid. Rachel headed to the master suite and peeled off the evening gown. She hung it in the walk-in, burying it among rows of 4-figure garments worn to galas she despised. Pulling on a worn cotton tee, she slid between the high thread count sheets. Freezing. Darkness swallowed the room, yet that vacuous feeling in her chest had receded. It was replaced by something new. A strange, jagged feeling settled in her chest. Part anxiety, part tentative hope, as her mind drifted back to that crude crayon sketch of 3 figures linked by ink hands. She replayed the memory of Carlos's face, the way his guarded expression had melted into pure light the moment his little girl giggled. And the weight of Sophia's embrace haunted her. Those tiny arms had clamped around her waist with a blind, fearless trust she hadn't earned. For years, Rachel had convinced herself that emotional entanglements were overhead costs she couldn't afford. That connection was just an inefficiency. She had treated affection like a bad investment. A liability to be cut from the ledger until tonight offered a peek at a completely different balance sheet. A reality where a stranger pulls out a chair for you, not because of your net worth or your title, but simply because they see a shivering human being who needs a seat. Rachel let her eyelids fall heavy, unsure if her path would ever cross with the humble father and his daughter again. She wondered if she was truly capable of rewiring her life, or if the gravity of her old, safe, solitary existence would eventually pull her back into orbit. But the certainty of one thing cut through the doubt. She refused to endure another 365 days existing like this. There was no point in conquering the world and building towering empires if the throne room was always empty. Her black card could acquire nearly anything on Earth, yet it was useless for purchasing a genuine spot at a dinner table. No amount of wealth could synthesize the heat of a child's hug or the quiet, unbought empathy in a stranger's gaze. Belonging was not for sale. For the first time in her corporate climb, Rachel Carter grasped that shared humanity was the only currency that held any real value. The rest was just static. She drifted off to sleep with the image of those crayon-drawn hands etched behind her eyes. When the first gray light of the new year filtered in, she ignored the reflexive urge to reach for her device. Instead, she moved to the glass, gazing down at the sleeping metropolis, a city still nursing its hangover from the festivities. She considered the difference between a resolution to achieve and a promise to become, quietly swearing an oath to herself. She wouldn't aim for perfection or omniscience, but simply to open the door to occupy space in the world, not as a titan of industry but merely as a human being. That simple permission was enough even as the winter sun began its slow, frigid ascent over the Manhattan skyline. Rachel remained at the window, witnessing the light climb the skyscrapers, feeling less like a spectator and more like a participant. It wasn't a fresh start because the calendar page had turned, but because she had finally decided she was worthy of one. This narrative serves as a stark reminder that professional peaks mean nothing in an emotional valley, and that a single humble act of kindness can rewrite a destiny. If this realization resonated with you, please hit the like button to support stories that prioritize the heart over the hustle. Make sure to subscribe for more unforgettable tales about breaking isolation, finding hope, and the power of second chances.